and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I'm going to be talking about Dublin. I feel it's a slightly rash thing for a man from Belfast to drive down to Dublin to talk to Dubliners about their city. And I hope you've all noticed there's a big question mark in the title of my paper, which is why this is my first slide. Here I am in the lion's den of Trinity College, Dublin. In fact, I'm in the den of the biggest lion of Trinity College because I'm actually in Sean Duffy's own office as I do this. And I'm conscious that there are a lot of big cats of Dublin medieval history out there. I can't see them, but they can presumably see me, waiting to hear what I'm going to say, and perhaps wondering whether I'm going to blaspheme, having seen the question mark in my title. So I have to do what Daniel did. I have to put my faith in my beliefs, and they are as follows. What I'm going to say is based on a quite peerless historical source, the Dublin Medieval Guild Merchant Roll. The evidence is absolutely terrific. My analysis is good as I can make it. And the interpretation I put on that, I'm hoping I can persuade you by. And maybe if I can persuade you with my interpretation, the big cats will prove to be big pussies and might even be purring for me at the end, but I'll wait and see in 45 minutes time whether that is really the case. But I'm going to begin by enlisting the support of the biggest cat of post-medieval Dublin history, Trinity College's own David Dixon. Because what does a capital city look like? Well, Dublin in 1790 looked absolutely as a capital city should, as David Dixon has pointed out in his wonderful book, Dublin, the Making of a Capital City. And so by 1790, when Dublin was more or less at the zenith of its importance, an importance I would argue coming from Belfast it has not enjoyed since. It was the political capital of a united country. The Act of Union, partition lay ahead of it. It was the permanent seat of the Irish Parliament and residence of the Lord Lieutenant, the location of the civil service. It was Ireland's legal capital, home to the Four Courts and the King's Inns. Trinity College, where I am currently sitting, is Ireland's sole university. It was the seat of the Church of Ireland and the Roman Catholic primates of Ireland. It was Ireland's banking centre and had been home since 1783 to the Bank of Ireland. Until the 1780s, it was the location of Ireland's sole white linen hall. So all the linen made in the north, in my part of the world, was carted down here and marketed through the Dublin White Linen Hall until Newry built its linen hall in 1783 and Belfast built it a little later. By 1790, it handled a majority of Irish domestic trade and over half of Irish overseas trade. It was the hub of a developing road network focusing upon Dublin and the terminus of two major cross-country canals under construction. It was the single greatest concentration of consumer spending power here in Ireland. The seasonal resort of the landed classes, and it was substantially larger than all other Irish and British cities except London. London was 5 times bigger than Dublin in 1790, but Dublin itself was more than double the size of the next largest cities. Those are Liverpool and Cork. And if we go back 500 years, let's see, this bloody bars in the way. If we go back 500 years, we can strike out most of those things. And all we're left with is the civil services here, but it's a small civil service. There is a concentration of consumer spending power, but the city with only 10 to 15,000 inhabitants is only a fraction of the size it will become by 1790. It's a very small place by comparison. So what kind of city was it? Was it truly a capital city, or was it a capital city solely in name and in fact, in practice, little more than a provincial capital? And that is the question that I propose to try and answer in my talk this afternoon. And to answer it, I'm going to use this very remarkable source, sources that would shed light upon the status and sphere of influence of a medieval city are very limited, especially for an early period. But for Dublin, we have the guild merchant roll that begins around about 1190 and continues to 1265. And using it, we can examine Dublin's status within Ireland and its status in relationship to other Irish and British cities and towns. It was very fortunate that on the 30th of June 1922, that roll was in the city archives and not in the Public Record Office. It's still there today. And you can examine it online. I put the link there to the link from the Dublin City Archive to the roll, where you can actually blow up individual entries and read it more clearly than you would be able to read the original. It was very fortunate as a document that the wonderful and late lamented Phil Connolly made a complete and very accurate transcription of it, which was published in 1992. And you see the cover of that volume there. And that published volume has since been animated in digital form. And I would just caution people, I found when I use the link there that I give at the bottom, if you click on that, it will not take you to every single entry for an individual place. I began by doing some work using the link, and I found that the links don't work for all of the entries for an individual place. So you can undercount, for example, how many people came to Dublin from individual cities. So for this talk, I've gone back to Phil Connolly's published original and made a completely new database from it, and done all of my analysis based on that, keeping as close as possible to the original as published by Phil Connolly. And what is remarkable about the Guild Roll is it tells you where almost 8,500 people came from, well, it gives you 8,500 entries, of which we know where the guildsmen came from for about 60% of them. And about a quarter of those are from Ireland, just under half from England, rather smaller proportions then from Wales, Scotland, and from Europe. So there's a good sprinkling of Europeans in the list. And Phil Connolly not only transcribed and published the transcription of the Dublin Guild Merchant Roll, she actually sat down and worked out where all these places were, which is no small feat, to try and work out from all the named places where exactly they were. And it's her place identifications that I am using here, subject to a very few corrections and additions, which I have been able to make myself. The big problem which most historians will pick on this point is we know where 60% of the guildsmen came from, but we don't know where the other 40% came from. So there is an issue. If we had information for 100% of these guildsmen, would it change the picture? Well, I don't think it would very much. If you look at this breakdown, and this is, these are for 1190 to 1222, that should be 1222 to 1245 in the center, so I've got a wrong date there, and then 1245 to 65. You see there that the basic proportions, always England is the largest share, the next largest share is Ireland, smaller shares for Wales, for Scotland, and for Europe. That is very consistent over time. What you do find over time is that as the number of guildsmen where we know where they came from increases, so people coming from Ireland feature more prominently. So if there's any under-recording, it is most likely, I think, to apply to people coming from Ireland. And if you look at the picture for Freeman, the picture for Freeman is very much the same. So if we subdivide the information and analyze it separately, what we get is the same picture coming through time and time again, no matter how we cut up the chronology. And that leads me to think that the patterns it's revealing are very consistent and very credible. So I think it's reasonable to suppose that people coming from afar are perhaps more likely to have their origins recorded than people coming from near. But there's nothing, I think, to suggest that patterns of recruitment from within Ireland or patterns of recruitment from within Britain would look very different if we had place of origin information for every single guildsman and every single freeman. I don't think that would change the picture very much. And you will see that as I go through the rest of this talk. And so what I've done is take the place of information and treat it as broadly representative and broadly reliable and capable, therefore, of revealing a great deal about the hinterland upon which Dublin drew between 1190 and 1265. So what was the geographical origin, the geographical provenance of those Dublin guildsmen and freemen? And to answer that, I've concentrated on the guildsmen who are coming from Britain and Ireland. I've left to one side those coming from Europe, and I've divided Ireland and Great Britain up into 17 regions based on their historic counties. So the boundaries you see on this map are the historic county boundaries, and there are 17 regions there. The smallest of them is County Dublin on its own. The next smallest are the four neighbouring counties of Kildare, Meath, Westmeath and Louth. And after that, the next smallest is the four South Welsh counties and so forth. I'm not going to spell them all out. You can see them on this map. And if you look at the provenance of the guildsmen from those regions, you get a very selective pattern. As you would expect, the region that supplies the greatest number of Dublin guildsmen is the actual county of Dublin. People are coming to be guildsmen in Dublin because they live within sight of the city, more or less, within walking distance of the city, and it's in their interest to enroll as a guildsman. So you find that the greatest numbers come from County Dublin, followed by what I call the Pale counties, that's Kildare, Meath, Westmeath, and Louth. And at the opposite extreme, okay, so you've got two Irish regions at the top, and at the bottom, the opposite extreme, the lowest numbers are coming from Munster, from Connaught, from Ulster, and only from the Highlands and Islands of Scotland do you have even fewer guildsmen coming. So what we have is a very polarized picture in the case of people coming from Ireland, and then a very interesting picture in between in terms of South Wales and the different English regions and Scotland, how it fits into that picture. In the case of England, we can break that. I've broken it down by county. And for England, we have population estimates of each English county in 1290. So this is showing guildsmen per head of population per English county. And it reveals a very reassuring pattern. As you would imagine, it was easier to come to Dublin if you were starting out from Cheshire or from Cumberland or from Gloucestershire or from Cornwall. They all face onto the Irish Sea. And that's where we get per head of population, more men coming to Dublin to join the Merchant Guild. It was a far longer, more difficult journey from the eastern side of England, from Essex or Suffolk or Norfolk. And per head of population, we have significantly lower numbers coming to Dublin from those counties. So they still came, but not in the same numbers. So we get what geographers, and my first training was in geography, what geographers would call a pattern of distance decay. The further you go away from Dublin, the smaller the numbers of guildsmen become, who these are men who are coming to Dublin to enroll in the guild. And this is exactly, other things being equal, what you would expect to find. And we could do the same analysis for the freemen. There's a much smaller number of men who became freemen. It was more expensive and it was more onerous when you became a freeman. And the freemen's lists only run for 20 years, unlike the 75 years for the guildsmen's list. But we can do the same analysis and it brings out a very similar result. And let me highlight it for you. You'll find that the regions that are most active in supplying guildsmen are also the regions that are most active in supplying freemen. Some slight differences in rank order, but there's a broad comparability there. And similarly, the regions that are least active in supplying guildsmen are also the regions that are least active in supplying freemen. And just look at Connaught and Ulster and the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. These are the regions least active on both those independent measures in supplying migrants to Dublin. There are just two exceptions or two differences between the two lists, and let me highlight them. And here they are. The northwest of England sends more guildsmen than it does freemen. And the east of England sends more freemen than it does guildsmen. And this actually makes good historical sense. The northwest of England is one of the least urbanized parts of England. And the people who are becoming freemen typically came from towns. So you see the northwest of England does well when it comes to guildsmen and less well when it comes to freemen. It doesn't have a sufficient urban base to supply a lot of freemen. Eastern England, in contrast, does not supply so many guildsmen, but it's what has some of the largest towns and cities in medieval England. So it does much better in terms of supplying freemen. It goes up, it has a higher rank order on this measure than on this measure. So this makes good sense, but the two lists largely tally, and I find that very reassuring. And they reveal this distance decay pattern that you see down here in the bottom left-hand corner. The highest densities are those on the whole regions closest to Dublin, and as you go away from Dublin, as you would expect, you get fewer men. There are 2 women on the list, but this is an overwhelmingly male list, which is why I keep referring to the men, because with 2 exceptions, those are the people we are told about. But if you look at that purple map down at the bottom there, you'll see very clearly this is the region, the Irish Sea region, as you would expect, is where most of these people are coming from. But within the Irish Sea region, there's a very conspicuous anomaly, and here it is: Welsh Wales. Welsh Wales, the part of mainland Britain that is physically closest to Dublin, sent very, very few men to join the Merchant Guild. Now, nowadays, if you were coming to Dublin from mainland Britain, how would you do it? Well, you drive to Holyhead and you get on the ferry and you come over on the shortest sea crossing from Holyhead and Anglesey over to Dublin. Before the Menai Straits were bridged, you would probably have done that journey starting from Carnarvon. But very few are doing that, and they're doing this for several reasons. One is this is a very mountainy area, very thinly peopled. More particularly, it is Welsh speaking and Welsh in its loyalty. And the Welsh lords and princes are basically at war with the King of England. And it's the King of England who reigns supreme in Dublin in this period. So there are cultural obstacles and political obstacles to people coming from Wales to Dublin. There's also the fact that Wales has nothing in the way of substantial towns, and people who are coming as guildsmen and freemen are basically coming as townspeople. So let me now turn to the urban origins of these people. If we take the largest places with 2,000 inhabitants in Great Britain, we find that only less than 10%, less than 1 in 10 of the population lived in such towns. But almost 40% of Dublin guildsmen are coming from these substantial urban places, and almost 60% of Dublin freemen are coming from these substantial places. This brings out very clearly the urban origin of these people. And when you take into account the many much smaller urban places in England, Wales, and Scotland, you can see that overwhelmingly those who are coming to Dublin are coming from an urban background of one sort or another. And if I focus in on the really top places sending guildsmen and freemen, this is what you get, and they're color coded. The red are the English, the yellow are the Welsh, the blue are the Scots, and the green are the Irish, and the French blue are the French. You see, so the Frenchmen from Bordeaux and Rouen actually show up rather well on the list. And you see on both of these lists, the guildsman list and the freeman list, that they're dominated by people coming from English cities. And on those four cities on the two lists, there's only one in common, and that's the most important city of them all, that is London. So the list is very, very much dominated and headed by London, the capital of England, seat of the English king, etc. Now, these are all the places which at the end of the 13th century had populations of at least 2,000 people. Here's Dublin with somewhat over 10,000, some figure I would reckon between 10 and 15,000, although some higher figures have been suggested. The largest of them all is London, the second largest European city north of the Alps, with about 75 or 80,000 inhabitants. So these are all the largest urban places, and these are the places sending at least 25 guildsmen to Dublin. And let me draw out for you some features of this distribution, which I think are worthy of note. First of all, for the first 40 years spanned by the guildsman listings, Londoners dominate. Londoners head the list. London, for the first 40 years, sends more guildsmen than any other urban place. And you can see that the largest city in England has very close relations with what was then the largest city in Ireland. And this is what the gravity model of migration would suggest ought to be the case. So this is a well-observed phenomenon, that interactions between equally large places or equally significant places tend to be very, very pronounced. After London, the next most important place is Bristol. In fact, by 1265, more Bristolians have come to Dublin than Londoners. Bristol has taken over from the 1230s, from London, as the place most actively sending guildsmen to Dublin. And this, of course, is as it should be, because Henry II had granted privileged rights to Bristolians here in Dublin when he held court here in 1172. And the next two most prominent places on the list are both have direct access to the Irish Sea. Gloucester here, which is a port at the head of tidal navigation on the Severn and the lowest bridging point of the Severn, and Chester up here on the River Dee, with the shortest sea crossing from England to Dublin. So we have a quartet of really important cities here supplying guildsmen. But let me draw your attention to two others, because if you were a high status English city, you didn't have to be on the shores of the Irish Sea to be active in supplying guildsmen. And here are two that were not. York, the capital of the north of England, the second most important city in England, and it sends, notwithstanding its distance from Dublin, it sends a sizable number of men to Dublin to become guildsmen. This is absolutely consistent with its high urban rank. And then down here, the former royal city, the former capital of southern England, Winchester, where England's most important international fair of St. Giles was held every year. and the Guildsman roll coincides with the period when that fair was absolutely at its zenith. It also sends very significant numbers of men to join the Merchant Guild in Dublin, notwithstanding its substantial distance away from it. So there is an important hierarchical nature to the pattern of recruitment. There is a sort of distance decay pattern, but there's also a hierarchical pattern whereby large and high-ranking places are quite strongly represented in recruitment. So we have hierarchical links, and we have lateral links, particularly across the Irish Sea. And what both features imply is that following the establishment of English rule, Dublin functions as very much a Western annex of England's more developed urban system. In a sense, what the English conquest has done is bolted Dublin onto the English urban network, the English urban system. It's simply become an extension of this very developed system. Now, let me also draw your attention to this particularly striking cluster of places focusing on the Severn Valley. I've already mentioned Bristol, but Cardiff on the Severn Estuary, Gloucester, then Hereford, Worcester, Shrewsbury, and then into the Midlands, Coventry is there, and numbers of lesser places. And these are very, very active in supplying Guildsmen and clearly have very close links to Dublin. So Dublin in this period has a dominant English culture has been imposed upon Dublin. And within that English culture, a West Country culture is particularly pronounced. And this shows up, as Roger Stalley has shown, in the architecture of the new nave commissioned for Christ Church Cathedral in the early 1230s. And I put for comparison there another wonderful building of the same date, which Roger Stalley has recently written about, Pershore Abbey. The point is, you could take the nave of Christ Church Cathedral and put it down by the banks of the Severn instead of the banks of the Liffey, and it would look completely at home. And that's because there was a very strong cultural affinity established between the two regions and revealed in this pattern of movement of Guildsmen. And the other clear feature, of course, is this one. Places were particularly active in their interactions with Dublin if they bordered the Irish Sea. And so here in the north, we have Ayr, Carlisle, Chester, Cardigan, Haverfordwest, which is just a few miles from Milford Haven, Cardiff, Bristol, Gloucester, down here, Exeter, very active, and then up the east coast of Ireland, Wexford, Arklow, Drogheda, Down, and Carrickfergus. So if you are close to the Irish Sea, about half of the Guildsmen come from places focusing on Irish Sea. It really underlines how what an artery of movement and exchange the Irish Sea so clearly was by that time, including from the south coasts of Devon and Cornwall. Now, if we focus just on Ireland, which this map and this table do, we get a very different picture. We get a much more regionally restricted picture. And in England, there is a gradual gradient from high levels of migration to Dublin from the west, tailing down to lower levels of migration from the east. But here in Ireland, we have more or less a cliff edge between the 9 or 10 counties of Eastern Ireland, from Antrim in the north down to Wexford in the south, and over to Westmeath in the centre. And once you go away from that East Coast zone, you get a very immediate and dramatic falling off in recruitment, which is what this map and diagram are intended to show. So we get a much more provincial picture for the recruitment to Dublin of Guildsmen. 60% of those with a named Irish place of origin come from just 5 counties: Dublin, Kildare, Meath, Westmeath and Louth. And these are the counties which Margaret Murphy and Michael Potterton worked on and wrote about under the direction of Neil Brady and the Discovery Programme's project on the hinterland of Dublin. And it shows up very, very clearly in the Guildsman figures, this area here. And if we add in the East Coast counties of Wicklow and Wexford and Down and Antrim, that brings the figure up to about 80%. This is where Dublin's sphere of influence is strong, and patterns of interaction with Dublin are regular and intense. And beyond that, they are much weaker. And I would particularly like to highlight in that context Waterford. Until I began working on the Guild roll, I had always regarded Waterford as Ireland's second city. And I've now revised that view. It is at best Ireland's joint second city. Its interactions with Dublin are very limited. The number of guildsmen it supplies are just 16 and 1 free man, according to the list. Cork, Limerick, Galway, even less. The joint second city is Drogheda. This is the city half the size of Dublin, the place most active in supplying guildsmen to Dublin for very obvious reasons. It is the functioning second city of the urban system that Dublin heads, and Waterford for most of this period actually lies outside of that functioning system, I would argue. So let me now just move on to looking at some changes over time. The pattern is very consistent over time, but we can detect some, I think, quite interesting changes. These are the annual numbers. We only have the annual numbers of guildsmen from 1222, and you can see the peak year is 1225 to 1226 with 224 enrollments. And there's a sort of boom period of recruitment here in the 1220s, which will never be repeated. This is seems to be the most active period. And it contrasts with these periods when recruitment was much lower, and the lowest of all is 1241 to 42, when there were just 60 enrollments. We get these isolated peaks, and I interpret these as the city authorities clamping down. It was in their financial interest to get people to register and cough up their 9-shilling admission charge. The city was making at least £40 a year out of admission fees. So periodically, I think it had purges on people trading without a license. And that's what I think these individual peaks possibly represent. So we're talking about very substantial revenues. The city has a really big vested interest in getting people to be admitted to the guild and to pay their 9-shilling admission fee. And what is intriguing to me is over this period, as an economic historian, I would assume that Dublin was getting bigger in size, as most European cities were growing in the late 12th and the 13th centuries. But although the city is probably growing, the number of guildsmen is flat. There's no tendency for the number of guildsmen to rise over time, which is slightly ominous development. And then if we add in the 20 years for which we have freemen's records, this is what we find. We find freemen's registrations are at a peak in the early 1230s, and then they slide down. You can see that. It's a very pronounced downward trend. And my hunch is the freemen's register begins the year after the Charter of 1229, which enables Dublin to elect a mayor. And so who is a freeman, because they can vote, they can stand themselves to be elected, becomes important. Keeping a record becomes important. I think that's why the freeman's roll begins in 1230. And there's an initial boom, and then the numbers slide down. So all taking these figures, all things considered, I think there's a boom period here in the second quarter of the 13th century, a particularly prosperous time for Dublin, when on the whole guildsman numbers are high and the freeman numbers are high. And of course, this is writ large in the in the fabric of the city. This is when St. Patrick's is being completely built on this spectacular scale. Christ Church is adding its new nave. The castle is being finished. The new friaries are being founded and established. There's an awful lot that's going on that's positive in this period. Full municipal self-government is granted to the city in 1229. It's a very positive dynamic time for Dublin, and I think that's reflected in the numbers. Geographically, what happens over time, I show here. Some regions become more important as sources of gilsmen, and in particular, the parts of Ireland closest to Dublin become more active in supplying gilsmen to the city, which of course make perfectly good sense. County Dublin first and foremost, then the four Pale counties, and then the East Coast counties. In contrast, the rest of Ireland makes no progress at all. At the beginning of the period, they're not important in supplying gilsmen. The rest of Ireland is not important. At the end of the period, they're still not important. They remain in us quite literally beyond the pale. Everywhere bordering the Irish Sea, including Welsh Wales, shows some kind of increment, even if it's very small, becomes a little bit more active. And most of England, which have been very active in supplying gilsmen early on in the early colonial migration phase, becomes less important. You notice in particular the Southwest Peninsula, the Welsh Marches, South Wales being so important to begin with, becoming much less important as you move beyond the early and initial colonial phase. So the balance is shifting over time. It's becoming geographically rather narrower, is becoming more sharply focused on Dublin and on the Irish Sea. It's becoming in that sense, a more provincial pattern. So I would argue that in this period, Dublin is a capital in waiting. Let me sum up. For Dublin's first 75 years as the seat of English royal power in Ireland, the bulk of those who became gildsmen and freedmen of the city came from a very wide geographical spread of places, great and small, extending far beyond Ireland's own shores, but coming overwhelmingly from Ireland's more commercialized neighbor and politically dominant neighbor, England. In a classic distance decay pattern, rates of recruitment declined with geographical distance, but the big exception here for commercial, cultural and political reasons is Welsh Wales. It's the exception that proves the rule, I would argue. And those that came from furthest away tended to come from very high status places: London, Aachen and Cologne in Germany, Antwerp, and Bruges in the Low Countries, Paris, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Lyon in France, Pamplona, Cordova in Iberia, Prato and Lucca in Italy. So people who came the furthest came from high-ranking places because of this hierarchical pattern. And in all of this, maritime connections were vital. Traversing Ireland seems to me to have represented a greater challenge in the 13th century than crossing the Irish Sea. People had some pretty grim experiences crossing the Irish Sea, but it was much less of an obstacle than crossing Ireland. And in all of this, townsmen were prominent. And the patterns of those urban recruitment from England imply that London was already the effective national capital of an integrated and hierarchical urban system, extending by the 13th century, not just throughout the English realm, but across the Irish Sea to embrace the coastal towns of Ireland. Patterns of recruitment from within Ireland implied that the same was not yet true of Dublin. Dublin did not stand in relation to Ireland as London did in relation to England. And quite tellingly, Ireland's second tier of walled cities in the south and west, Waterford, Cork, Limerick, Galway, sent relatively few gildsmen and freemen to Dublin. And this to me is one of the most striking features of the gildsman evidence. After the conquest, Ireland's key links lay across the Irish Sea with London, with Bristol, with Chester and Gloucester, not to the south and west, with New Ross, Kilkenny, Waterford, Youghal, Cork, Limerick or Galway. You can see that very clearly here, the way it's very much looking to the east and turning its back on the west. Drogheda is the big exception here amongst second-tier Irish towns because of its proximity to Dublin. It is effectively the second city within the very provincial urban hierarchy, urban network that Dublin heads. And the effect here in Ireland of English conquest have been to incorporate Dublin and its hinterland into England's own well-articulated and integrated urban system. I think that comes out very clearly from this evidence. So at the peak of its 13th century prosperity, Dublin ranked below London and York in size, status and influence, and is probably better prepared with the English provincial capitals of Bristol, of Lincoln and of Norwich. Within Ireland, Dublin functioned as de facto a provincial capital with a catchment area of Guildsmen and freemen largely confined to the future Pale and the counties of the east coast. And once you went beyond 120 kilometers from Dublin, recruitment declined dramatically. You went really over a cliff edge. And particularly the English colonized parts of Munster did not send significant numbers of men to the Merchant Guild. So as the principal seat of English power in Ireland, Dublin's fortunes were in the ascendant from the 1170s to the 1240s, when it acquired many of the outward trappings of a capital city. In the opening decades of the 13th century, at the height of Europe's own commercial revolution, is when we see sustained investment in the city's institutional and physical infrastructures. And it was these that promoted Dublin's urban growth and helped to attract guildsmen and freemen from far and wide. And here I'm deliberately referring to Howard Clark's wonderful Dublin fascicule and the encyclopedic information, which I raked through to support this statement. But thereafter, from the 1240s, as the progress of English conquest faltered and investment dried up, Dublin's fortunes flagged, and the region from which it recruited guildsmen and freemen narrowed. So let me just finish with these observations. Between 1190 and 1265, the record of those admitted to Dublin's Merchant Guild reveals Dublin's incorporation into England's well-articulated and geographically comprehensive urban and commercial network, but the absence of any equivalent network in Ireland. By 1290, London had achieved national hegemony, but Dublin had not. The latter was a provincial capital, but not yet a capital city. Thank you.